Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingrassia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm really glad you could be with me today as we continue this present series of episodes that we've been involved with that I'm calling When You or Your Spouse Doesn't Like Sex. And I'm going to get into that in just a moment. But before I do, I wanted to share something that was on my heart that I just been thinking about. And basically, I hope it's not weird to say it this way or something, but I just want to tell you that I'm really proud of you for listening to this podcast. Not because I'm so great or anything like that. I just believe it tells me something about you. If you've made it this far, if you've been with me through this podcast, and you're listening to me as I speak to you through these podcasts, it tells me something about you. It tells me that you want to be a better man. It tells me that you're open. You're seeking some information, some guidance, some help, some wisdom, some strength. You're seeking to close the gap between the man you've been and the man that you know God wants you to be. You know, a lot of people choose to be like water and just take the path of least resistance because that's easier, right? If a leaf was to float down and fall on a river, it would be swept along. The leaf doesn't have to do anything. It's just swept in the current. And that's the way a lot of people choose to live their lives. They're not proactive. They're not trying to do anything about it. They're just, in a sense, riding the current. They're like water, taking the path of least resistance. And they're not really trying to do anything to help their situation, to help themselves as a person, to help their relationship with God, maybe to help themselves be healthier with sex. And the fact that you're listening to this podcast tells me that you're seeking something, you're open, and you've made it this far, and that means that there's a level of self-evaluation going on in your head and your heart and your life. And you're trying to look at yourself, you're trying to examine yourself, you're trying to understand yourself, you're trying to understand your story, you're trying to connect the dots, you're trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together, you're trying to figure out what steps you can take to be proactive and do something about it. You're trying to deal with your issues with sex, your issues with your addiction to pornography or masturbation, or the problems that you've had with managing your sexual self in a way that's honoring and glorifying to God. So I'm just really glad that you're with me on this journey. I'm on my own journey of purity. I'm on my own journey of trying to be a healthier person and a better man and a healthier man sexually. I'm trying to learn what it means to honor God with my heart, my life, with my sexual gift, honor my wife and my marriage. And I'm very honored and flattered that you would be with me on this journey. And I just hope that it's encouraging to you and helpful, and it's bringing strength and help and light and truth to you on your journey. And we're in this together. So I just say welcome to the Power of Purity podcast. It's a blessing to have you with me. And with that being said, I guess we can go ahead and jump into our episode today as we continue when you or your spouse doesn't like sex. And we've identified in our past several episodes the unfortunate reality, the sad reality that in many, if not most marriages, there is often significant tension and difficulty and hardship around the issue of sex. People miss each other, people have hurt feelings, people are confused and disoriented. And sometimes this happens because of the difference between sexual interest and desire. One person typically has a higher sexual interest, the other person has a lower sexual interest. This disparity causes a tension that leads to misunderstanding, hurt, confusion. And so the title of this episode, When You or Your Wife Doesn't Like Sex. What do we do about this? Well, I guess one of the things I've been trying to say in the podcast is that if you don't like sex, if you have a problem with sex, if you have a diminished interest in sex, if you're resistant to the possibility of sex in the context of your marriage, I just believe that there's room for growth and healing, because we've also identified that we believe that God made us sexual creatures. God intends for us to be sexual, that sex is a wonderful, beautiful, awesome gift that God has given us, and He intends it to be a blessing in our lives and in our marriage. And He intends us to experience with our spouse this connection, this relational warmth, and being present to each other, and touching each other, and enjoying each other, and delighting in each other. And so through sexual intimacy, God intends for us to experience something very wonderful and beautiful in the context of our own heart and life, and in our marriage, our relationship with our spouse. So if we are struggling with this diminished interest in sex, we have the opportunity to consider, well, what would it mean for me to be healthier? How do I close the gap between where I am and where I need to be? How do I get over my hang-ups about sex? Why have I struggled so much with sex? Why don't I like sex? Why can't I enjoy it? Why does it feel unsafe to me? Well, we've identified in this series of episodes 4 reasons that often contribute to diminished sexual desire. And they are, number 1, you and your relationship with your spouse. Number 2, you and your relationship with sex. Number 3, you and your relationship with your body. And number 4, you and your relationship with yourself. And we've learned that these things can cause a diminished sense of our sexual self and profoundly harm our marriage. You know, I'm a counselor, and almost without exception, when there's these sexual issues in the context of the marriage, people get very, very hurt. I can just share my own personal testimony. You know, in the early years of my marriage, my wife did not want sex. She wanted nothing to do with it. She resisted against it. She didn't like it. It didn't feel safe to her. She didn't want anything to do with it. And I am not suggesting that I was justified or that I handled it in a healthy way at all. I think I handled it in horrible ways that took our situation from bad to worse. But the point I'm making is that it was profoundly difficult for me. It hurt me very deeply. I didn't understand. I was attracted to my wife. I love my wife. I want to touch my wife. I want to enjoy my wife. I love my wife. And her diminished sexual desire made me feel rejected. What's wrong with me? Why isn't she attracted to me? Why doesn't she want to be with me? Why can't she enjoy me? It hurt me profoundly. It confused me. It overwhelmed me. And so these 4 issues that cause diminished sexual desire have profound implications in the context of marriage and marriage relationship. And so if you're in the place where you think you're struggling with any of these things, and you're open to the possibility of trying to understand some things about yourself and maybe work on some issues and deal with some things in your own heart and life that will help you be in a healthier place with yourself and help you be in a healthier place with sex and will help you be in a healthier place with your spouse, it will go a long way toward the possibility of being healthier together sexually and intimately in your marriage, and that's what we're after. So in the verbiage of the title of this episode, when you or your spouse doesn't like sex, the answer essentially is, we want to help you grow and get to the place where that isn't such a problem, and you're learning to like sex and to enjoy it and to enter into the fullness of the gift that God intends it to be for our lives and our marriage. And in view of that, I've had 9 principles that I've been sharing, 9 principles that are proactive steps that we can take when and if we're ready to work on these 4 issues of diminished sexual desire as we move toward health and wholeness and healing and redemption. And we have covered 6 of those principles so far. Number 1, there is help available. Number 2, it's often a combination of all 4 of these issues that we need to work on at the same time. Number 3, it may take a prolonged period of time to work through these various issues. Number 4, you have to decide to do the work. Number 5, God will do His part in healing your life and your marriage. And number 6, when you decide to work on it, it often gets worse before it gets better. And with all that being said, it brings me to point number 7, where we continue today. Point number 7 is this. You can and should focus on the relational issues that exist in the context of your marriage. The fact is that there are 4 issues that we've been talking about, that we've identified, that contribute to diminished sexual desire for people. You and your relationship with your spouse, you and your relationship with sex, you and your relationship with your body, and you and your relationship with yourself. And the first one, which is you and your relationship with your spouse, is the only one that you have any control over in your spouse's life. Or in other words, if your wife has issues with sex itself, that's something that she's going to have to face and understand and struggle with and work through if she's ever going to come to the place where she's in a healthier place with her and sex. If your wife has issues with her own physical body, that's something she's going to have to face and understand and struggle with and work through if she's going to come to the place where she's in a healthier place with her and her body. And if your wife has issues with herself, like body image issues, her self-image, her self-esteem, the way she sees herself, the way she feels in her own skin, the way sex makes her feel because of her own relationship with her body, that's something she's going to have to face and understand and struggle with and work through if she's going to come to the place where she's in a healthier place with her and herself. But if your wife has issues with you as her husband, that's something that you absolutely have the power to work on and influence as you seek to understand her heart and her concerns and her hurts and her disappointments and her thoughts and feelings and what she needs in her relationship with you. And then, as you seek to move toward her in the context of your relationship, and you're seeking to address many of these issues that might exist between the two of you, you're trying to understand what her complaints might be, and you're trying to work on those complaints. And as you seek to become a safer man to your wife, you're seeking to close the distance that might exist relationally between the two of you, emotionally between the two of you. You are absolutely having a direct influence upon your relationship with your wife and the way she's experiencing you in that relationship. You see, what I'm trying to say, guys, is that there are things that you do have the power to work on between you and your wife that will help to create the kind of relational environment that's conducive to healthier sexual relationship between the two of you. So I guess what I'm saying is that you're only responsible for you, and your wife is responsible for her. And what you need to do is work on the part that you can work on in order to help your relationship with your wife be healthier than it's ever been before. And then, hopefully, your wife will be willing to work on some of the issues that she needs to work on between her and sex, her and her body, her and herself. And the good news is that if both of you are willing to do some work on yourselves and on your relationship, then there's great hope for the forward progress and the healing and redemption of your relationship and your marriage as you guys move into your future together. And by the way, for what it's worth, I remind you that Sherry and I are living proof that a very deeply and profoundly broken marriage and a very sexually dysfunctional marriage can be healed and redeemed and restored by the very powerful grace, mercy, love, and healing of God. And that brings me to my 8th principle, which is this. You have to be patient with your spouse and accept them right where they're at. one way or the other, I'd advocate that you have to come to the place where you're willing to work with your spouse. And just like God accepts you right where you're at in your relationship with Him, right? God sees you. He knows you're not perfect. He knows you're not there yet. He knows you have a lot of stuff you got to work on, but God accepts you where you're at. I would advocate that we need to be willing to accept our spouse right where they're at and then slowly move forward from there. Remember, this thing is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And if you're lucky enough and you're blessed enough to have a spouse who might be willing to begin to look at their issues, they have a heart to try to understand their issues, they have an interest in becoming a healthier person, they're willing to maybe begin to look at some things and deal with some things, they're willing to submit to the divine surgery that I was referring to in our last episode, as God begins to dig around in their heart and life to help them become a healthier and a more whole person, then you are an incredibly blessed person because you have a spouse who recognizes that if we always do what we've always done, then we're always going to get what we've always got. And at least your spouse is willing to get in the battle. At least they're trying to understand some things. They're trying to change and grow as a person. So one thing's for sure, you need to be kind and understanding and patient as God begins to take them down the healing path that He has intended for their life. And just like God's accepted you right where you're at, with all your warts and all your imperfections, you need to accept your spouse right where they're at in their journey, with all their warts and all their imperfections, and you need to give them the time and the space they need as they work through the things that they need to work through. And by the way, I freely admit that I did not do a very good job of this in my relationship with my wife. And we spent much of the time in the early years of our marriage, the dark years, the disaster years, blaming each other and being hurt and being angry at each other and disrespecting and misunderstanding and attacking each other, essentially. More than I respected my wife and understood her and had a heart of empathy and tried to work with her and be patient. And I'm just saying, guys, that all that stupid stuff, all it's going to do, it's going to be counterproductive. It's going to slow the process down. It's going to be distracting to your spouse because of the noise you're creating, the dissonance in the relationship. It's going to distract them from the work they have to do with God because you're making so much noise. They can look at you and blame you and be distracted by you, so they never get around to letting God deal with them. So all that stupid stuff's going to do is slow the process down. It's going to make it harder than it needs to be. So let me ask you guys this question. What do you think will be more conducive to the growth and the healing and redemption of your relationship with your spouse and your marriage? Your anger and frustration and unkindness, impatience and selfishness, and angst and resentment and demand, and on and on and on. Or your kindness, your understanding, your patience, your acceptance, your encouragement, your prayer, your support, your love. Which one do you think is going to be more conducive to the health, the wholeness, the progress, and redemption of your spouse and of your marriage? So please, guys, take my advice. Try the best you can to be patient with your spouse. Accept them where they're at on their own healing journey. And if I had to choose a proof text here, I think I'd choose Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, which, by the way, are the words of Jesus himself, taken directly from the Sermon on the Mount and what's commonly known as the Golden Rule. Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. So in everything you do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. In other words, you treat your spouse the way you would like your spouse to treat you, and it's going to go a long way toward facilitating the healing process that you guys are in the midst of. And with that being said, it brings me to principle number 9, which is my last principle, my 9th principle. And I'll just let you know that for a long time I had 8 principles here as I was working on this message. And then as I was reviewing it the other day, getting ready to do my recording for the podcast, it just occurred to me, number 9, so I'm throwing it in for free. And number 9 is this, you guys. I would suggest that it's a messy process. The process we're talking about is a messy process. And in a way, maybe this point is actually complementary to point number 6 that I made when I said when you decide to do the work, it often gets worse before it gets better. Kind of goes along with my 9th point here, that it's a messy process. In fact, I'd advocate that when God begins to work deeply and powerfully in a person's heart and life, it's almost always going to be a messy process. It's not usually going to be a neat, clean, or tidy process. It might be 2 steps forward, then a step back, and then 3 steps forward, and then 2 steps back. And sometimes it might even feel like 1 step forward, and then 5 steps back. It's not always easy to take this journey as you attempt to look at and deal with and process and understand some of the most painful and confusing and overwhelming and shameful places of your heart and life. So as a person is contemplating these 4 issues that we've identified that contribute to diminished sexual desire, maybe it has to do with me and my relationship with my spouse. Maybe it has to do with me and my relationship with sex. Maybe I have work to do around that. Maybe it has to do with me and my relationship with my body, or me and my relationship with myself. You see, as a person is realizing this and they're beginning to enter into this journey of self-reflection and self-examination and trying to understand who they are, trying to understand maybe why have I struggled so much with sex? Why do I have such a diminished interest and desire in sex? As a person begins to take this journey, they're beginning to evaluate and maybe look at some of the more painful things and confusing and overwhelming and shameful things and places of their own heart and life. It can be really difficult. I shared with you guys earlier about my own process, and I talked about how Sherry and I went to counseling for 6 years, but in large part, I think that had to do with the fact that I was kicking and screaming and fighting God much of the time, which made the process counterproductive and made it take longer than it needed to take. You see, it's a messy process. Sometimes my heart was compliant. It was in a good place. I'm cooperating with God. I'm trying to lay still on the divine table of surgery as God's doing His work. Other times it hurts, and I'm angry, and I'm upset, I'm overwhelmed, I'm confused, I'm disoriented. And so I get mad at God, and I kick against the goad, and I pull back. And so it's a messy process, this idea of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. In fact, I think it's fair to liken the process of sanctification in the life of the believer as a kind of civil war, because in a way, you're in this epic battle with yourself. You're in this epic battle with your story. You're in this epic battle with God. Maybe you're in this epic battle with this current version of yourself, this version who seems to be broken sexually, this version of yourself that you have no interest or desire in sex, but you intuitively know something's wrong with that. That's not the way God wants me to be. So why am I the way I am? What do I need to work on? And what do I need to see and understand about myself so I can become more alive sexually and be the person that God wants me to be? So in a way, you get in this war, this civil war with yourself. And there'll be times when you're doing really good and things are feeling pretty good and you're making forward progress and you have hope in God and you're growing and you're doing the work. And then there's going to be times when you're doing really bad and you feel overwhelmed and you feel confused or you feel angry and you feel like your spouse isn't doing their part, or it doesn't feel good, you feel like quitting, you feel like giving up, you feel confused. But I would say, guys, that's okay. It's just part of the deal. It's part of the human condition, and it's part of the healing process, because the fact is, as our 9th point informs us, it's a messy process. It's not necessarily a neat, clean, tidy process. So understand that, realize that, embrace that, keep moving forward. You're going to have good days and hard days. You're going to have days that seem cursed and days that seem blessed. And you're going to have days that feel good and days that really hurt. But just keep moving forward through the mess, and God is going to prove himself faithful to you, I promise. And let me just say in conclusion of this particular point, it's a messy process, that testimony is absolutely true in my own life and story, my healing journey, the journey of my marriage with my beautiful wife, Sherry. Believe me, those 6 years were unbelievably messy. 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 1 step forward, 3 steps back, 4 steps forward, 3 steps back. It was up and down. It was in and out. It was side to side. It was good times and hard times, and times of peace and times of torment. And it was a very messy process. And sometimes I loved my wife, and I was moving toward her, and I was compassionate and praying for her. And other times I was so angry at her, and I felt so hurt by her, and I couldn't understand her, and she didn't make sense to me. And it would go in and out and up and down, and it was a messy process. So we just have to accept that reality, because that's what it is, and put our hope in God and keep moving forward. So you guys, with that being said, in conclusion of this episode, which I have entitled, When You or Your Wife Doesn't Like Sex, we've discovered that there are 4 common reasons that contribute to low sexual desire for many people. And those 4 reasons: number 1, you and your relationship with your spouse; number 2, you and your relationship with sex; number 3, you and your relationship with your body; and number 4, you and your relationship with yourself. And we then discovered 9 principles that are proactive steps that we can take if we're in the place where we're ready and willing to begin to do the work that we need to do to work on these 4 issues that have caused diminished sexual desire in our hearts and our lives. And those 9 principles: number 1, there is help available. Number 2, it's often a combination of all 4 issues that we need to work on. Number 3, it may take a prolonged period of time to work through these various issues. Number 4, you have to decide to do the work. Number 5, God will do His part in healing your life and marriage. Number 6, when you decide to work on it, it often gets worse before it gets better. Number 7, you can and should focus on the relational issues that exist in the context of your marriage. Number 8, you have to be patient with your spouse and accept them right where they're at. And number 9, it's a messy process. And I would suggest, you guys, that those 9 principles are just a little bit of what you can do when, as the title of this episode says, when you or your spouse isn't interested in sex. I can assure you that help is available, growth and healing and progress is available, and if we're willing to engage these principles and begin to work on these issues that are causing such a diminished interest and desire for sex in the context of your marriage, then it's possible, as we engage these 9 principles and work them and continue to move forward, that we will be closing the gap between where we're at and where God's taking us, and we're going to move toward the health and wholeness and healing of our marriage, and specifically the sexual part of our marriage. So with that being said, guys, let me just say that I hope that this series has been a blessing to you. I hope that it's helpful on your journey of purity and your journey of sexual health and wholeness in the context of your marriage. Thank you guys so much for listening to this podcast, and I'll look forward to seeing you in our next podcast next week. God bless you, and have an awesome day.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.